In the summer of 1785, the last ship in the Continental Navy was auctioned off for sale, leaving this fledgling country with no naval assets other than the revenue cutter service that collected customs fees. It would be almost a decade before Congress again authorized a standing Navy to protect U.S. interests and in turn become part of the Navy that would build USS Constitution. Hi, I'm Carl Herzog, public historian for the USS Constitution, and I'm joined today by Bob Allison of Suffolk University, president of the Colonial Society and one of the co-chairs of Revolution 250, who's written extensively about the American Revolution. Bob, welcome. Thanks for a chance to talk about this
Thank
today.
you, Carl.
Also with us is Captain B.J. Armstrong, the director of the Naval Academy Museum and author of a number of operational books in the early Navy, including his most recent work, Small Boats and Daring Men, Maritime Raiding, Irregular Warfare in the Early American Navy, looking at sort of the lessons of these early Navy operations in the 18th and 19th century. B.J., welcome.
Thank you so much for having me aboard today, Carl. And I just want to point out, as your viewers can see from my uniform of choice today, I'm here in my personal and academic capacity, and the opinions I express are mine alone and do not represent the United States Navy or the U.S. government. And now the lawyers are happy with me.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for both of you for joining us today. We wanted to take a minute today to talk about the Continental Navy as it relates to the later U.S. Navy the Constitution was part of, because the gap there is something I think a lot of people don't know about. And as we're coming into the commemorations of the 250th anniversary of the Revolution, the role of the Continental Navy and how it related to the later Navy and the things it did seems to be something of a mystery too. A lot of visitors often here at the USS Constitution Museum as well. The Continental Navy was established very early on in 1775 in the fall, just a couple months ago, celebrating its 250th, and came in part out of some initial use by George Washington of hiring private schooners to do some work. But when they looked at why a Continental Navy was developed, BJ, I was hoping maybe you could help us out in understanding what was the Continental Congress's expectations and goals for a Continental Navy. Did they really expect that this force was going to take on the British Royal Navy directly?
Yeah, as Samuel Chase, one of the Congress's delegates from Maryland, said, the construction of an American fleet was madness. The idea of going up against the most powerful Navy in the world, arguably, seemed like a foolish idea. And it largely started with George Washington and the siege of Boston, because at that point, geographically, and still to a certain extent today, the city of Boston itself is a peninsula or kind of an island. And once the siege was established, the British were reliant on their sea power to bring supplies in and maintain the force that was in Boston. And so George Washington wanted to attack those supply lines. And that's how, his leased schooners got started, which leads to the October 1775 creation of a Continental Navy. I think at first, the Continental Congress was not thinking of this naval force going and fighting ship to ship, fleet to fleet in large naval actions against the British. They were looking at it more as a situation where the Continental Navy could be sent to certain locations where the British had been spread out. In 1775, at the start of the war, the British had ships on the American coast, but it wasn't the entire Royal Navy that was here. And so they were sort of spread out. And so the envisioning of a Continental Navy squadron that maybe could go handle a few ships at a time, in particular, they were thinking of the Chesapeake and the Carolinas, where 2 to 3 Royal Navy ships had been gathered in Charleston or around Norfolk. And they thought that in piecemeal form, a Continental Navy might be effective at first, while they planned to build a larger Navy as the conflict went on. It went from an initial group of ships, 4 to 8 ships, to an appropriation to build 13 frigates across the colonies to create a real naval force. But they knew that was going to take time.
Yeah, that's a substantive sort of outpouring for, such a young Navy, or such a young fledgling force, especially at a time when they hadn't really even decided, there was a lot of, seems like influence of people who weren't even sure they were completely ready to depart the British. Bob, we know that this was a contentious sort of debate in the Continental Congress. What was the opposition saying? What were the obstacles to this and the arguments against it?
Well, BJ kind of made the point the opposition was making. It navies are expensive things, and many of the colonies had their own navies, and so building this is going to take time. It's going to take money, and then manning it will also be difficult. With a militia, which is what still was a hope we could rely on. I mean, these guys can go home after a battle. If you're at sea, you can't. So there is this idea, this is a big, expensive undertaking. We're not exactly sure what the outcome of all of this is going to be. And then also there's an ideological fear of navies being somewhat separate, being a way to project power and get into foreign adventures. Maybe we just want a small defense force. And so it really is the cost as well as the time it will take to build a navy. The British, we're building 8 ships, or going to get 8 ships that have already been built. The British have 78 ships on this North American station, and even though, as BJ said, they're spread out, still that's 10 times as many as the Americans are able to muster at the end of 1775, early 1776.
Yeah, you mentioned too that idea of sort of a sovereignty. How much of that was that at all like an issue for a lot of the people who were still imagining at that point that there may be some resolution to this conflict beyond complete separation and independence?
Yeah, this is October of 1775. Congress won't declare independence until July 1776. There still is kind of a hope among some more moderate folks like John Dickinson and others that, will reconcile, the king will come to his senses. Others, like certainly George Washington and the Massachusetts delegation, think that's really a vain hope and that independence is going to be the end.
Yeah. So the Continental Navy ends up in existence for about 10 years, if you count all the way out to that last ship, the Alliance, being auctioned off in the summer of '85. But their sort of successes and activities seem more concentrated a little bit earlier on in the height of the Revolution. BJ, when all was said and done, how successful was the Continental Navy at what it was doing?
Well, there are certainly, successful elements to the service of the Continental Navy in the war. And I think one way to look at it would be, at the tactical and operational level of the conflict, we see a number of significant moments where American naval forces make a very real contribution. We think of the Battle of Valcour Island on Lake Champlain, where, Benedict Arnold tactically loses the battle, but the British take so long in winning that winter sets in and they can't invade that winter. And therefore, the Americans have more time to prepare for what will become the eventual victory at Saratoga, which then arguably leads to French involvement in the war. And so it's a naval battle that helps set the stage for all of that strategic level activity. And then you've got tactical success of folks like John Paul Jones and his sailing aboard Ranger, his defeat of HMS Drake, and then eventually his sailing on Bonhomme Richard. So we have these success stories that we see throughout the war. But I think when you take a step back and look at what the Continental Navy really contributed, those 13 frigates, pretty much all of them were either captured, sunk, or their own crews scuttled them to keep the British from getting them, rather than having some grand success. And ultimately, it's really the French Navy that's the decisive naval force in the American Revolution, when they win at the Battle of the Chesapeake outside of Yorktown, right before the victory, Washington's victory at Yorktown, where they keep the British from reinforcing Cornwallis at Yorktown. And so the naval elements of the war are really important. We haven't mentioned the privateers yet, which do have a economic impact on the British during the war. So the naval elements are important, but a lot of them are sort of in the background of the strategic successes.
So by the time then that the war is over and independence is there, it seems like this is a force, or for what's left of it, that had even less of sort of a functionality. Was there any argument for keeping this, or was the affordability argument, Bob, just putting this all out to pasture?
I think the affordability was the big issue. And Robert Morris, who is the Minister of Finance, he's responsible for trying to pay this massive debt the country incurred, also becomes in charge of the Marine Department overseeing this. And in 1785, the year when the Congress decides to sell the last of the frigates, the United States also defaults on its loan from the French. That is, it can't make its payment to the French. And also the Continental Army, the soldiers worried about being paid, had driven Congress out of Philadelphia. So you have this big financial problem the country is facing, and is unable to pay its debts, and both to the French and to its own soldiers. So not only building a navy, but maintaining one was an extravagance that the country didn't seem to be able to afford.
And yet 10 years later, or not even 10 years later, 9 years later, we're right back where we started. What changed in that time, Bob?
Well, you want me to? Yeah.
Sure.
Two things. One, the United States does adopt a constitution, which gives the federal government the power to raise revenue, which the Confederation Congress did not have. Secondly, Algiers had declared war on the United States and was capturing American ships, really at the instigation of the British. And so Americans were shut out from the Mediterranean, about 120 Americans being held in Algiers. There had been about a dozen captured in 1785, and then at that point there was no wherewithal to do anything about it. Thomas Jefferson, the minister to France at the time, had thought we should actually build an alliance of other states. He also thought we should build a navy, and he communicates this to John Adams, the minister to London, who also was the proponent of the Continental Navy. And Adams says, I agree, good luck convincing Virginia to go along with building a navy. That was in 1785, 1793. Even then, though, there's an argument, why don't we just pay Portugal to patrol the Straits of Gibraltar? Why don't we pay someone else to do this for us? But it really was both that the government had the wherewithal to do this, as well as this threat from Algiers that provokes Congress in 1793 into, again, creating a naval force.
And so this time they're creating a new, different kind of naval force. But yet again, there's sort of diverse kind of threat that they're facing. BJ, could you walk us through, you mentioned the tactical successes of the Continental Navy and what their goals were. What was the anticipated use of this new Navy initially? What did they expect that these ships are going to be going up against, and how did that shape how the Navy was formed?
So as Bob points out, right, navies are enormously expensive things, right? They're capital ships because they're capital intensive, you might say. And while there are some folks in those years during the Articles of Confederation period who did advocate for a navy, I'd point out that Alexander Hamilton in Federalist Number 11 makes an explicit case before the Constitution is ratified that the nation needed a navy because it was going to be stuck between these two great powers of Britain and France, and it was going to have to be able to interact with the world and defend its trade and its commerce. And then that proves true when Algiers begins attacking American merchant vessels in the Mediterranean. So the envisioning of what a navy might be, there are divergent ideas. Hamilton suggests 12 ships of the line, so the biggest battleships that you can possibly have in the age of sail, because he figures that many will swing the balance of power if the Americans get threatened by one of the great powers. But the expense of that is just astronomical and too much. And so addressing the threat that the Americans face, which is the Barbary powers, the sultanates, the quasi-independent kingdoms that line the North African coast that kind of owe allegiance to the Ottoman Empire, that have corsairs and privateers that sail from them. They're often called the Barbary pirates. Protecting against those is really the goal of this initial naval force. And that's the reason that it's 6 frigates that are selected as the first ships to be constructed to make up the core of that first United States Navy. You know, frigates are a large enough vessel that they can hold their own in a fight, but they can also get across the Atlantic, right? They can travel around the world. They carry enough crew, enough food, enough supplies to be able to make a global deployment. And so frigates end up being the compromise, might be the wrong word, but the sensible solution to the threat the Americans face from maritime insecurity around the world, as opposed to a direct war with one of the great powers. And so that's largely where Constitution comes from, as one of those original 6 frigates.
Yeah, and we obviously see that at the real initial establishment too, where while the Barbary conflict is the driving factor for the Naval Armament Act and for the creation of this Navy, its first deployments turn out to be in the Caribbean against French privateers. That globetrotting willingness to protect U.S. interest anywhere scatters all over the place. But yet this too turned out to be an incredibly tight congressional vote, right, Bob? What were the arguments here that were preventing, like, why was so much of Congress still opposed to this idea?
Well, a couple of things. One, you do have as this Navy is being constructed. Remember, Congress authorized it in 1793, the construction of these 6 frigates. In 1795, the United States makes peace with Algiers. So then the opponents of the Navy say, well, why are we building this since the threat's no longer there? Others, like Hamilton notably, and others who had been advocating naval power said, well, we're still going to need one. And Washington decides to continue building 3 of the frigates. And then 1796 and 97, trouble begins with the French. And that's really when the Navy, as we know it, is formed, the U.S. Navy in 1798 under President Adams, the creation of a Navy department separate from the War Department. As Adams had always been a believer in a Navy as an important thing, but there's opposition, particularly from Virginia. And remember, the country is expanding into the interior. And the thought was, well, the threat really isn't somewhere in the Mediterranean or the Caribbean. The threat is with Native Americans or with the British in Canada or with the Spanish. So why are we worried about building a Navy that's going to get us into adventures all around the world? So there is this opposition, and primarily is driven by the cost as well as a fear of what happens when you have a naval establishment. Will that move us into being globetrotters? And that you have this two-edged sword about, you know, both fear of cost and then fear of creating this aristocratic group. I mean, what do you call someone who commands more than one ship? And the idea of an admiral and this hierarchical structure is something that some Americans reacted to with great fear.
Yeah.
If I could just jump in and chime in for a minute. You know, Bob points out Washington's effort to keep the frigates going, right? So a treaty gets negotiated with Algiers, and per the Naval Armament, an amendment to the Naval Armaments Act, the construction of the frigates is supposed to stop if there's a treaty with Algiers.
Right.
And Washington, you know, in a deft political move, says to the Congress, you know, if we shut off building these frigates, we're going to lay off all those workers and we're going to stop buying all those supplies in your congressional districts. At which point the Congress comes back and says, well, maybe we should keep working on 3 of them instead of all 6, right? So that idea of creating what today we would call an industrial base and creating the infrastructure that would be required for a Navy to exist, Washington is wise enough to figure out how to keep that on life support and keep it going, even though there is this fundamental question until the war with France begins as to whether we're really going to have a Navy.
It's really a very smart political move on Washington's part, both to have the different frigates constructed in different ports, and actually logistically, it would have been impossible to build them all in one, but also the supplies come from throughout the country. So it is actually a national effort to build this Navy that does draw in congressmen from Georgia and other places who might not want to know why we need a Navy, but it does benefit their economies.
Yeah, BJ, you mentioned sort of the infrastructure of the Navy that pops up at this new one. This is seemingly so much more complex, and both out of necessity and structure, in order to have these assets forward deployed around the world compared to the Continental Navy that preceded it, right?
Yeah, I mean, the Continental Navy is largely a pickup game, right? They're starting from scratch. They're starting from nothing. And by the time you get to the era of the introduction of the Constitution and Washington's first administration, there are some lessons that the Americans have learned about how you do this sort of thing. You know, the late naval historian Jim Bradford talked about the construction of a modern Navy requiring three things. It required purpose-built warships, so warships that weren't just merchantmen that had been converted, but that were purpose-built and constructed for this job, you know, like Humphrey's super frigates that Constitution is part of. A modern Navy required an infrastructure. It required basing. It required an administrative and bureaucratic support system that could keep it not only funded, but maintained and supplied and able to sail. And it needed a professional officer corps, right? That was the third thing. You know, not just folks who had spent time on board merchant ships and maybe could figure out how to fire a gun, but true professionals who made this their career and could become specialists. And at the beginning of the American experiment, all three of these things are in doubt. And it's really what they're trying to construct during the Washington and Adams administrations of how do you put all three of these elements, the purpose-built warships, the infrastructure, the bureaucracy, the Navy yards, and professional officer corps, how do you put that together for a new nation?
It seems like that's really the establishment of the Navy as we know it today, able to meet those goals and meet those requirements, and do it pretty much anywhere. And consequently, Constitution seems like, you know, very much a product of that new Navy that as a ship that couldn't have, it doesn't seem like it would have been feasible to have been built or even exist in the Continental Navy, right?
That's right. And, you know, Humphreys himself, the Joshua Humphreys, who designs the super frigates, designs Constitution, he cut his teeth on warships by being the shipyard owner or the designer who converted the first Continental Navy ships in the fall and winter of 1775. So he starts to learn from the very beginning about what it takes to build what are going to be called the super frigates, right? Constitution and the other frigates are larger, more powerful. They're built of this southern live oak, which is denser and kind of stronger than most of the woods that are used to construct European vessels. It is a super frigate, a 44-gun frigate, as opposed to a 32 or a 38 that the British might commonly build. And so, you know, Constitution is really a great example of the outgrowth of all of these efforts coming together.
Yeah. And while that ship design and construction faces these abrupt changes, the development of that officer corps that you talked about takes a little bit longer. We know that of those first 6 frigates of that new Navy, virtually all 6 of those commanding officers had served either in the Continental Navy, or 4 of them had served in the Continental Navy. 1 was a privateer. 1 had been in the Continental Army. So the new Navy is still inheriting a personnel base and an officer corps that takes a little time to sort of redevelop, right?
That's exactly right. And it's going to be the quasi-war with France, that first conflict that starts in 1798. And then following that, the First Barbary War, that really begins to develop that group of junior officers who are going to rise through the ranks, are going to be those kind of lifelong naval professionals, your Stephen Decaturs, your Isaac Hulls, that are going to develop over time. You know, I think of a number of the luminaries of the War of 1812, the great captains and heroes of the War of 1812. they're all junior officers in this era, and they're learning their trade, and they're learning how to be warfighters as well as how to be capable mariners in these two conflicts. And so it's kind of a generational move to create a truly professional officer corps.
Yeah.
The other piece of this too is that these officers, many of whom, the lieutenants in the war with France, who then are the ones who are going to be in the Barbary Wars and really become this officer corps, really prove that a naval officer corps isn't hostile to the idea of a republic. In fact, they are sustaining it during the war with Tripoli, and then in the War of 1812. There's a great story of John Adams being asked in about 1814 if he is surprised at the success the Navy is having in the war against Britain. I remember he had signed the commissions for most of the men who now are captains, and he says, no, he's not surprised. And then he realized this may seem like a short answer. So then he elaborates that when he was the minister to France in 1785, an American ship came to Le Havre, and the French minister of the Marine and others went to see it. And the French minister of the Marine said, the Americans will become the world's greatest maritime power because they have the capability of building the best ships. That is, they have the natural resources to do this. And then Adams also thought we had the men most capable of manning the ships and commanding the ships.
Phenomenal. Thank you so much for sort of bringing this all to light for us today, Bob, BJ. Over the next year, as we go into the celebrations of 250, I'm sure we'll be hearing more and more about this and looking at kind of differentiating and seeing the evolution from America's Continental Navy to the standing Navy of the 1790s. So thank you so much for joining us today to talk about the Navy before the Navy. If you have any closing thoughts that we may have missed on either of this, Bob, BJ?
The only thing I would say is, the founding era, the revolution through the early American era of the U.S. Navy, seems like it's a long time away, right? It's 250 years away, and it seems therefore to maybe be lacking in relevance to our modern world. But I think just from our conversation today, we've seen, right? Navies are expensive. How do you build a maritime infrastructure? How do you have an industrial base? How do you prepare officers for the world they inhabit? These are all the fundamental questions that we still face today in the United States and for the United States Navy. And so studying our past can help us think more clearly about our present. And I really love that the Constitution Museum helps us do that.
We are certainly in a pivotal time for that. Jeva, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time. Thank you, everybody watching. And stay tuned. We'll be doing more your history presentations in the coming months on YouTube Live and archived there, as well as available through the USS Constitution Museum website. Thank you very much. Bye, PJ. Thank you so much for joining us today.